What do you do when joy and pain come at the same time? What happens when a new beginning comes, but is marked by pain? This is the story Hollywood hasn't told. B.D. Wong, Tony winner, Hollywood's first style icon, and one of the first openly gay Asian American stars, isn't just breaking barriers on stage. He's burying his pain there. Stick with us until the end, because B.D. Wong's journey will move you in ways you never expected. Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Born in San Francisco in 1960 to Chinese-American parents, Bradley Darrell Wong was the kind of kid who noticed. He noticed his father standing a little straighter next to his white colleagues. His mother avoided eye contact when someone mentioned the boy next door who grew up that way. He noticed that every compliment ended with a but. He's talented, but a little weak. Polite, but not manly enough. And when BD looked in the mirror, that gentle, curious, different face, he didn't just wonder if he was good enough. He began to fear that being himself would never be enough. In a community shaped by survival and silence, being different was not only difficult, but dangerous. For many Asian families, especially those steeped in the sacrifices of first-generation immigrants, there was a lesson even greater than love. Never shame your family. And being gay? That was not only shameful, it was unspeakable. It was a secret so heavy it could not be named, let alone explained. There was no room for weakness in a family that valued discipline, tradition, and masculine pride. There was no room for quirkiness in a lineage built on honor, struggle, and the quiet hope that the next generation would belong. From an early age, B.D. Wong knew he was different from other boys. As they chased footballs and traded baseball cards, he found himself drawn to stories, to the flashing spotlights, the allure of a well-written line, the quiet wonder of being someone else. Where others found pride in competition, he found solace in characters who said things he could never say. He memorized scripts instead of statistics, sought truth in pretense when real life was too sharp to touch. But he also learned, all too quickly, that those passions had to be hidden, recast as harmless hobbies instead of aspirational dreams. Because if he leaned too far, someone might look too closely, someone might see the truth. But how can you hide what lives not just in your heart, but in the very marrow of your bones? Every time he laughed a little too hard, gestured a little too expressively, or stepped outside the narrow stereotype of the good Asian boy, B.D. Wong felt it, a subtle, bitter protest. Not big enough to be called rejection, but colder than silence, a change in a teacher's tone, a look from a friend, a long pause from a parent. It wasn't hate, it was something much more suffocating, disappointment wrapped in politeness, annoyance masked as concern. The unwritten rule was clear. If he wanted to be accepted, he had to transform himself into someone else. Love in this world wasn't unconditional. It was conditional on expression. And so he became a master of acting, long before he ever stepped on stage. He played the good student, the good kid, the normal boy. He learned to shut himself away, to nod in agreement when someone said, "You'll get over it." He buried his feelings so deep they couldn't be named. Have you ever done that? Smiling in the middle of a storm just so no one would ask what was really going on inside? But even in the silence, something stirred. In the corner of his childhood bedroom, B.D. had built a secret world. He would read monologues on the wall, sing when no one was home, imitate movie characters until he felt truly in character. The stage was his escape, not just from the world, but from himself. Because for a few minutes in the spotlight, he didn't have to explain who he was. He could be someone, anyone, without judgment. But that escape came with a sense of guilt. In many Asian families, dreams are negotiable. You may want success, but it has to look a certain way. A doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. Pursuing the stage felt like betrayal. Being gay felt like erasure. Yet deep down, B.D. felt both were necessary for survival. There was one memory he would tell years later. A family dinner. He was about 12. Someone at the table had made a joke about those people on TV, men who walked oddly or wore bright clothes. The whole table laughed. But B.D. didn't. He couldn't. He stared at his rice bowl and felt a lump in his throat. because they weren't talking about strangers. They were talking about him. A version of himself he hadn't even admitted to himself yet, but they were already condemning him. And in that moment, a silent promise was made. He wouldn't let that shame define him forever. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, but someday he would stop pretending. Years later, when he finally came out, first to himself, then to his family, and finally to the world, it wasn't an act of rebellion. It's a return to the child who stood silently, waiting to be seen. Have you ever felt like you had to shrink back just to fit in? Like you had to silence a part of yourself, just to be loved, just to belong? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your story matters, and you're not alone. But this is just the beginning of B.D. Wong's journey, because the boy who learned to disappear would one day stand center stage, and not just any stage, Broadway. The very world that made him feel invisible became the place where he found his strength, his voice, his truth. No more masks, no more hiding. Next, we'll enter the moment B.D. Wong turned quiet survival into bold expression, and how one groundbreaking performance changed everything. Before the applause, before the award ceremony, before the curtain even went up, B.D. Wong stood alone outside the Broadway theater, clutching a crumpled resume, muttering lines. He was just an aspiring actor, one of thousands in New York, trying to break into an industry that didn't know what to do with someone like him. He wasn't white, he wasn't straight, and he didn't want to be invisible anymore. But he didn't know then that the role waiting for him on the other side of the audition room wasn't just a part in a play. It was the beginning of being truly seen. B.D. Wong's path to that moment wasn't quick, and it certainly wasn't glamorous. It was a slow process, through college drama classes, community theater productions, and auditions that ended with a polite, maybe next time. Over and over again, he was cast in boring roles: quiet waiter, kung fu player, anonymous extra. And each time, he couldn't help but wonder, is this all they see when they look at me? But he kept showing up, because deep down he knew, if he got the right part, he wouldn't just act. He would prove something. And then M. Butterfly came along. Everything changed. In 1988, M. Butterfly was the most daring play on Broadway. Political, seductive, and unlike anything that had come before. The story revolved around a French diplomat who falls in love with a Chinese opera singer, Song Li-ling, a secret agent. But the real risk wasn't in the plot. It was in casting an actor who could embody Song's complexities. When B.D. Wong auditioned, he didn't just act, he became Song. Enigmatic, graceful, fierce, and vulnerable. It was clear at once. This wasn't just a role, it was him. The audience didn't just applaud, they held their breath. Then they stood. Critics called him a revelation, a force the likes of which the stage had never seen before. When the Tony Awards came, B.D. Wong didn't just take home the trophy, he broke a barrier. He became the first Asian American to win Best Actor in a play. That night, as he stood under the spotlight and the crowd roared with applause, he should have felt unstoppable. But beneath the cheers, something else was stirring: loneliness. Because being at the top is powerful, but it also means standing alone. Imagine that. He had just broken a barrier the world thought was unbreakable. There he was, center stage, holding the trophy, history being made. And yet, there was no one standing next to him. I knew I had won because I had done well, B.D. later said. But I also knew that Hollywood still didn't believe an Asian face could succeed. No movie offers, no leading roles, just the same old roles: salesman, sidekick, supporting role, and polite rejections. He had climbed the mountain, and at the top, no doors opening, just the cold, lonely wind of an industry that still couldn't see him. And the burden of being first never lessened. It grew heavier with each rejection. When B.D. Wong won a Tony in 1988, he made history, the first Asian American to win Best Actor in a play. But behind the applause and the spotlight, he carried something few people saw: the quiet burden of being the first. And with it came the pressure to be perfect, to perform well, to never make a mistake. He became a symbol for an entire community before he had a chance to fully understand or express himself. And beneath that pressure, a deeper fear began to grow, because B.D. Wong was gay. But in 1988, he didn't come out. At the time, being openly gay was a risk in Hollywood. But being gay and Asian, that combination was considered career-ending. He had just become a groundbreaking Asian American icon on Broadway, celebrated, noticed, held up as a role model. And with that fame came a terrifying question. What if everyone knew the whole truth? So he kept quiet. He avoided interviews that were too personal. He turned down roles that might reveal too much about himself. It wasn't out of shame, it was out of survival. The message he kept getting, whether spoken or implied, was clear. You can be Asian, or you can be gay. But you can't be both. Not yet. Have you ever been praised for one part of yourself while being asked directly or silently to hide another? That was BD Wong's reality. On stage, he lit up the stage with groundbreaking performances. But offstage, he was forgotten. Not by choice, but by necessity. The silence he carried was not only isolating, it was painful. A silent erasure that grew heavier with each role, each smile, each moment he was not allowed to fully live. But silence has its limits. Because the boy who once hid behind the words of others finally found the strength to speak his own voice, with honesty, courage, and no script. Let's step out of the spotlight and follow BD Wong into the most powerful role of his life, the one he lived. With love, fatherhood, and support, he began to rewrite not only his own story, but also open up possibilities for countless others like him. His journey from heartbreak to healing, from silence to complete self-acceptance, is a reminder that presence is not just about being seen, it's about being whole. Because once you step into the light, you not only change your own story, you become the light for others' stories. Have you ever felt pressured to hide a part of who you are to protect your dreams? Drop your story in the comments, because we're not just telling BD's story, we're honoring yours too. Long before the world began celebrating rainbow families, BD Wong and his then partner, Richie Jackson, were quietly envisioning a future that defied convention. Their 16-year relationship was not one of red carpet flings or tabloid headlines. It was a relationship that took place out of the spotlight. A love that was solid, honest, and deep. Theirs was not defined by flashy gestures, but by quiet strength, a same-sex love that endured in silence, nurtured without permission, and held firm even when the world turned its back. Richie was more than BD's partner. He was BD's partner in building something bigger. A life rooted not in fame, but in family. At the turn of the millennium, they decided to become parents via surrogacy. A bold choice in 2000, especially for two men in a country still hesitant to fully accept LGBTQ+ families. Every checkup brought hope. Every ultrasound deepened their love. And then the day came. The boys were born. But joy never comes without risk. That same day, one of the twins, Boaz Dov, passed shortly after birth, a loss that reshaped everything. Imagine that moment. The hospital air thick with antiseptic and uncertainty. The nurses move gently. Richie is silent. And BD Wong, still dazed, still grieving, holds her newborn son as she says her final goodbyes. The scene is unscripted. No stage can carry the weight of life and loss at the same time. No applause can touch that silence. And then, in the depths of that pain, BD begins to write. Not to stand out, not to be praised, but simply to survive. To understand the pain. To hold on to love. To find meaning in a pain too deep to put into words. BD Wong's memoir, Following Fu, The Electronic Adventures of the Chestnut Man, is not your typical celebrity memoir. It is raw, intimate, and beautifully told through emails, diaries, quiet confessions, and heartbreaking surprises. There's no drama, no acting, just the truth. With gut-wrenching honesty, he reveals the emotional trauma of gay surrogacy, the joys of fatherhood, and the pain of losing a child too soon. And woven into it all is something even more personal, where BD Wong chose to come out, publicly, powerfully, and entirely on his own terms. Think about it. BD Wong doesn't appear in headlines or glossy magazine covers. He appears through the most human lens possible: love, loss, and fatherhood. In the quiet pages of his memoir, amid the pain and power of his truth, he declares, "I am a gay man, I am a father, and my family is real." At a time when Hollywood still demands silence, BD chose honesty. He opened the door not with fanfare, but with courage. And when asked why, his answer still rings true. I couldn't have raised my son to be honest and proud if I hadn't been willing to live that way myself. It's not about politics. It's not about making a point. It's about parenting. How can you raise a child in a world full of half-truths if you're not willing to stand up for your whole truth? That simple statement, spoken quietly and honestly, has become a rallying cry for gay parents around the world. So here's a question for you who are watching. Have you ever had to make a decision in your life, not just for yourself, but for someone you love? A decision that scared you, but freed you? If so, we want to hear. Share it in the comments. Let's celebrate those quiet acts of courage. For B.D. Wong and Richie Jackson, their romance ended in 2004, after nearly 2 decades together. But even as their romantic relationship faded, their commitment to parenthood remained unwavering. Together, they raised Jackson with tenderness and a firm belief that family is not defined by gender or convention, but by presence and care. Though no longer lovers, B.D. and Richie remained a force, parents, companions, and pillars in their son's life. In a world that often views separation as a failure, they offered something different, a quiet, graceful model of the modern gay father, adapted, honest, and wonderfully whole. Today, Following Fu is more than a memoir. It's a roadmap. For anyone who is gay, grieving, dreaming of family, or uncertain about their place in the world, it says, you belong here. Your story matters, even the painful parts. And in a career defined by transformation, this was B.D.'s most powerful act yet, stepping off the stage and into the light of his own life. But B.D. Wong's story doesn't stop there. In the years that followed, he not only inspired from afar, but also showed up. He became a beacon for a new generation of queer Asian Americans, not through speeches or flashy gestures, but through his quiet presence, his heartfelt honesty, and his powerful reminder, you don't have to be someone else to be seen. So stay tuned. Next, we'll explore how B.D. Wong turned his personal truth into purposeful action, using his voice and presence to break down barriers and redefine what it means to lead with heart and authenticity. What part of B.D. Wong's journey moved you the most? Was it the pain he carried in silence, the unconditional love he gave, or the quiet courage to be true to himself? Leave a comment below. Your voice helps keep stories like this alive. Let's build this space together. We're creating a space where they can continue to grow, inspire, and reach those who need them most. There was a time in Hollywood when Asian actors were asked to shrink into stereotypes, into silence, into barely their roles. But B.D. Wong didn't shrink. He expanded the frame. And in doing so, he rewrote what it meant to be both Asian and openly gay in American entertainment. When B.D. Wong took on the role of Dr. George Huang on Law & Order SVU, it wasn't just a performance. It was a gentle, powerful statement. Huang wasn't a caricature or a sidekick. He was an FBI psychiatrist, calm, intuitive, and incredibly insightful. His power lay in his silence, and when he spoke, his words held weight. Over the course of 12 seasons, Wong portrayed a man who used his intellect not as a shield, but as a bridge to grieving victims, suspects in crisis, and a justice system that often judged too quickly. And in doing so, he brought something rare to television, an emotionally rich, morally grounded, fully grown Asian man. At a time when on-screen masculinity is often defined by strength and ostentation, Dr. George Huang offers something entirely different. Does true strength come from calm? Does quiet understanding trump confrontation? His character doesn't rely on stereotypes or drama. He simply exists, whole and authentic. Dr. Huang isn't marginalized or pigeonholed. He's respected for his depth, his empathy, his unwavering presence. And perhaps most powerfully, his identity isn't hidden or exaggerated. It's woven naturally into who he is, subtle, grounded, and profound. And then came Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg's cinematic masterpiece that defined a generation. Amidst the chaos of dinosaurs and disaster, one character remained calm, precise, and alive, Dr. Henry Wu. Played by B.D. Wong, Wu was not a running joke or a running gag. He was a geneticist, a genius mind who made the impossible possible. As the sequels continued, his role deepened. He was not just a character, but a thread that ran through the core of the franchise. And in a global blockbuster franchise that grossed billions of dollars and captivated audiences around the world, one of the most important roles went to an openly gay Chinese-American actor. Think about it. For all its spectacle and sci-fi, Jurassic Park made room for B.D. Wong is seen, respected, and becomes the center. For many young Asian Americans, watching B.D. Wong in Jurassic Park changed their lives. Finally, an Asian man wasn't there to serve or disappear. He was an innovator, a scientist, a man whose ideas shaped the world, even if those worlds had claws. Have you ever watched a blockbuster and suddenly thought, wait, someone like me just changed everything? That's exactly what BD did. And the most powerful thing? He's not done yet. So what happens when a trailblazer keeps going? Find out, because the next part of his story is about lifting others up. In 2015, he took on a role that defied every binary in the comics. White Rose, Mr. Robot's mysterious, genderless antagonist. Clad in elegance and shrouded in mystery, White Rose was unlike any television character before her. Cold, intelligent, commanding, she was a hacker, a diplomat, a visionary, and a menace. But she was also very human. The character transitioned not for show, but for meaning. In White Rose, gender wasn't the focus, it was the lens. And B.D. Wong, who went on a journey of self-discovery, didn't just play the part, he understood her. The critical acclaim was undeniable. Rolling Stone hailed it as one of the best gay performances of the decade, while the New York Times praised its cold weight and quiet power. But for B.D. Wong, it was more than just a career triumph. It was a spiritual homecoming, a moment where art, identity, and purpose finally converged. In interviews, he shares how White Rose allowed him to express aspects of himself that had long been locked away. She lives in a world where she's struggling to maintain control, he says. That struggle, the feeling of having to constantly perform to survive, is something I'm very familiar with. And perhaps that's what makes B.D. Wong's career. He doesn't just act, he explores. He brings his own life experiences, his pain, his triumphs, his long journey to self-acceptance to every role. He takes the pain of invisibility and turns it into power on screen. In recent years, BD has used his platform to advocate for mental health, LGBTQ+ youth, and Asian American representation in media. He doesn't just act anymore, he mentors, teaches, uplifts. Whether it's speaking at conferences on queer representation or mentoring young Asian actors who fear there's no place for them, he's always opened doors. So take a moment, stop and think. Which BD Wong performance changed something in you? Was it the haunting brilliance of White Rose, the calm wisdom of Dr. Henry Wu, or the unwavering compassion of Dr. George Huang? Tell us in the comments, which role touched your heart the most, and why? Because your voice matters. And maybe B.D. Wong's journey has helped you see yourself more clearly. And don't go anywhere, because B.D. Wong's influence doesn't end when the curtain closes. His story continues, far beyond the stage. Next, we'll explore how he became a mentor to queer Asian youth. Not just a role model, but a roadmap. A voice whispering to the next generation, you are not alone, and you are stronger than you think. In Hollywood, some stars shine with extraordinary power. Others shine simply by standing still and letting others see themselves in that light. B.D. Wong has never sought attention, but in doing so, he has become a beacon for thousands of people who never saw themselves in the stories around them. For many young queer Asian Americans, Wong was more than just a successful actor. He was the first living proof that you could be all of these things: gay, Asian, creative, tender, strong, and still belong. Wong's influence as a performer is strong, but it's his influence as a mentor, spiritually, emotionally, and culturally, that has perhaps left an even deeper mark. Over the years, he has been a quiet presence in schools, LGBTQ+ youth centers, universities, and community forums. Not as a guest of honor, not as a celebrity to be celebrated, but as a mirror, as a witness, as a listener. He didn't come to impress, he came to connect. And in those rooms filled with anxious teens and curious parents, he spoke candidly about growing up with two invisible burdens on his shoulders: being gay in a world that demands silence, and being Asian in a world that demands invisibility. There's a myth B.D. Wong once shared during a student Q&A that to be loved you have to split yourself in two. To fit into a space, you have to quietly let go of the parts of yourself that don't fit the script. But that's not love, that's performance. And we're not meant to perform, we're meant to be whole. Have you ever felt like you had to shrink, filter, or edit yourself just to be accepted? Do you feel like parts of yourself are left behind when you walk into certain rooms? Share your truth, because being seen starts with being authentic. Wong speaks openly about loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, but the kind that simmers when you're surrounded by people who don't really see you. He describes it as a silence that lives under your skin. That silence, he says, is something that many queer Asian youth carry with them throughout their lives. Rarely talked about, rarely acknowledged, and often misunderstood. His words aren't dramatic or angry. They come with a gentleness. They carry the weight of truth. And that's what makes them so powerful. He's a longtime supporter of the Trevor Project, GLSEN, and API equality. But more than attaching his name to organizations, BD shows up. He shows up to events not as a representative, but as a companion. He tells stories about his early career, being the only Asian face on set, or the only gay person in the room, and how he learned to stop asking for permission to be real. He gave unwavering permission to feel, to exist, to matter. Although B.D. Wong never called himself an activist, his presence spoke volumes. His influence was not loud or confrontational, it was a quiet transformation. With every role, every word, every choice, he gradually reshaped what people believed a gay Asian man could look like, sound like, or aspire to be. His form of activism was his own presence, not perfect or staged, but genuine and real. He didn't want to be a flashy icon. He made room for complexity, for contradictions, vulnerabilities, and truth. You don't have to be extraordinary to be taken seriously, he once told a room full of gay college students. You just have to be yourself, and that's enough. For rising stars like Bowen Yang, Joel Kim Booster, and Nico Santos, B.D. Wong is more than a pioneer. He's a platform. A role model who not only opens doors but also stands, steadfastly, unwaveringly, holding them open for those who come after him. He's proven that success doesn't have to mean silence, and that you can thrive without sabotaging yourself. So now ask yourself, who is that person in your life? The person who not only helps you dream, but also makes you believe that your voice belongs here. B.D. Wong never seeks recognition. When younger actors praise him, he responds with humility. He often turns the spotlight away from himself, shifting the conversation to the next generation, about justice, about difference, about safety. He doesn't lead with ego, he leads with care. In interviews, he has talked about how exhausting it can be to constantly justify your existence, to be the first or the only. But he keeps doing it. Not for the accolades, but because he understood what it meant to have someone like himself from a young age. If I saw someone like me on screen when I was 16, he once whispered, I would cry, just from relief. That statement alone has become a lifeline for many young viewers who were never taught that it was okay to be themselves. He's also not afraid to challenge systems that hold others back, whether it's rejecting traditional casting formulas or advocating for deeper immersion in context. B.D. Wong isn't content with fitting in. He wants that fitting in to be meaningful. He has spoken out about Hollywood's obsession with stereotypes and its failure to see Asian men as whole, romantic, and emotional human beings. But he doesn't stop there. He is a model for a new path forward. In every respect, his work is personal. It's not built on slogans, it's built on stories, on hugs exchanged after a college seminar, on handwritten letters from students who saw his face and felt hope, on the quiet but powerful act of showing up, over and over again, as yourself. So the next time you see B.D. Wong on screen, as White Rose or Dr. Huang or some other character yet to be written, remember this: the real performance is not what's captured on film. That's how he helped reshape a generation's perception of possibility, not through acting, but through authenticity. What does it mean to leave a mark? Not on billboards, but in the hearts, in classrooms, in the quiet lives of people who feel less alone because of him. Let's follow BD Wong beyond the stage and the screen, into the spaces of everyday life where his impact is truly felt. Not in the headlines, but in his authenticity, in his presence, in the subtle power of living fully, fearlessly. We ask, when the lights go out, what part of his story will stay with us? What part will we take with us, follow with us? Because this story is not just his, it is ours. After decades of breaking stereotypes, on stage, on screen, and off, BD Wong now wakes up in a world that once refused to imagine him. A gay Asian father, legally married, walking his kids to school on the tree-lined streets of Brooklyn. No protest signs, no paparazzi, just a man, his family, and the life they built with courage, compassion, and choice. When BD and Richie Jackson ended their long-term relationship, they did something that defied every acrimonious Hollywood breakup stereotype you've ever seen. They didn't disappear from each other's lives. They didn't fight over custody. Instead, they raised their son, Jackson Fu Wong, together as two fathers committed to a love that went beyond romantic love. And that's where the story really begins. Because queer families don't always work out the way society expects. And when they do, when they're built on patience, boundaries, and enduring love, they teach us all a new kind of success. Have you ever seen that happen in real life? Two exes lovingly raising children together? How many people, gay or straight, can say they've done that? And just when life seemed to be coming to an end, BD Wong opened up. He met Richard Schnorr in 2010 at a book launch in New York, a creative soul with a quiet strength and a warm smile. For years, they kept their love private, away from the cameras and the press. Not out of fear, but to protect something very personal. In 2018, they married in a small ceremony in Brooklyn. No Hollywood noise, no press, just love. The quiet moment made history. A Chinese-American actor who had been told his love would never be enough stood up proudly and said, "I do." In later interviews, Wong described Richard as his peace of mind, a balance after his career struggles, the loss of a child, and the pain of past relationships. Their story isn't glamorous, but it's real. A love rooted in healing, quiet joy, and the power of being seen. BD Wong's marriage to Richard Schnorr was hailed by the American media as a living proof that Asian gay men can still live sincerely, build lasting love, and become great fathers. Their marriage has quietly broken long-standing stereotypes that gay men, especially those of Asian descent, cannot have stable relationships or raise children. Together, BD and Richard have become shining examples for Asian gay couples around the world, proving that a happy, lasting life is not only possible but also beautiful. Today, BD Wong no longer chases the spotlight. He no longer auditions to be seen or strives to be heard. Instead, he builds a home where love is simple and sacred. He co-parents his son Jackson with care and devotion, supports Richard's creative journey, and shows up in the places that matter. Schools, advocacy conferences, and quiet community spaces where voices can be heard. Scrolling through his social media, you won't find red carpets or carefully curated outfits. You'll see a meticulously baked birthday cake, a photo of a leisurely Sunday stroll, a genuine smile at the dinner table. These aren't moments to be celebrated, they're important. BD Wong has chosen something much rarer. Authenticity over glamour, presence over fame, and a life that quietly tells the next generation, you can have this too. In interviews, BD rarely calls himself an activist, but let's be honest, he doesn't need to be. His life is about activism. Not loud, but living proof that gay Asian men can be husbands, can be fathers, can be whole people. He's also deeply involved in mentoring younger generations, especially gay Asian creatives trying to navigate a world that's still skeptical of their place. Whether it's a light-hearted chat behind the scenes or a heartfelt message to a rising star, BD Wong doesn't preach. He listens, he affirms, he reminds people that their path, however winding, is worth taking. So here's a question for you as someone watching this. What would the world be like if we celebrated stories like his? Not just the hardships, but the peace that comes afterward. Stories of queer life are often about challenges, moments of courage, and overcoming. And while those moments are incredibly meaningful, but they are just the beginning. What we need just as much are stories of continuity, the peaceful, beautiful rhythms of everyday life, the warmth of a morning cup of coffee together, the laughter of dropping the kids off at school. The kind of life that B.D. Wong built, a life that is not just accepted, but truly celebrated. A life that reminds us that authentic expression is more than just presence. It's about belonging, peace, and the freedom to be ourselves. Among his most quoted quotes, B.D. Wong once said this, "Not with any pomp or grandeur, but with quiet power. I am not a hero. I am just an Asian man who chose to be honest, so that the next generation doesn't have to be brave like me." That's another quote, right? Because it's not just for gay youth. It's for anyone who has ever felt like they had to adjust to fit in. For anyone who has ever been told that their identity, culturally, emotionally, is too difficult, too complicated. B.D. Wong never rushed into the spotlight for attention. He didn't bury the truth just to get another role. Instead, he took the harder path, the path of authenticity. He affirmed his identity and culture, and in doing so, he became a role model that he never saw growing up. His life teaches a quiet but profound truth to young Asians around the world. You don't have to choose between where you were born and who you become. Being rooted in your culture and being true to yourself are not opposites. They are two halves of the same powerful identity. B.D. Wong has shown us that being true to yourself doesn't have to be loud or demanding. Sometimes the bravest act is simply living fully, fearlessly, and without regret. Be true to yourself, and in doing so, light the way for others. In an industry that had no place for someone like him, B.D. Wong not only found a place, he created one. With quiet defiance, unwavering grace, he carved out a space that no one else could reach. And now, with every role he plays, every word he speaks, and every truth he lives, he keeps that space open for all who are still trying to enter. Full presence for the children who watch quietly from the shadows, for those who wonder if there is a place for them, for anyone who has ever been told they are too different, too loud, too weak, or simply not enough. And that space, B.D. Wong isn't just claiming it for himself. He's opening it up for all of us, so that no one has to wonder, do I belong here? And perhaps that's what makes B.D. Wong's journey so unforgettable. It's authentic, quietly powerful, and a life lived in his own way. If his story makes you feel anything, hope, pride, even a little more appreciation, then we're glad you're here. Thanks for watching. If you found meaning in this video, please support our channel by subscribing and discovering more stories worth telling. And to our most thoughtful and sincere viewers, we'd love to know, how did you experience this story? Your voice helps us grow, and we're just getting started. You heard his voice for years, but never knew his name.
And I'm also, dude, what's up? Sanjay from Nickelodeon's Sanjay and Craig.
He made millions laugh on Disney and primetime TV, all while hiding one truth that could have ended his career. Brown, gay, invisible. In a world that only wanted parts of him, he chose silence to survive. Until one day, he didn't. So ask yourself, can you be loved by millions and still feel unseen? Let's start at the beginning. Dayton, Ohio, 1974. Where cornfields stretch beyond cultural understanding and where a boy named Maulik Pancholy enters a world that may not have a place for him. His parents, immigrants from Gujarat, India, come to America with ambition, tradition, and a hope that fits in a suitcase. And as they settle into life in the Midwest, Tupperware parties, Diwali celebrations, and cautious optimism, Maulik begins his own journey, one they never planned. On the surface, he looks like any other American kid, with his wide eyes and curious smile. But growing up in a sea of brown people comes with its own loneliness. His classmates gobble peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. He opened his lunchbox, smelled the spicy aroma of khichdi and yogurt, and was met with looks that said, "What planet did this come from?" His friends spent the weekend watching football. Maulik? He rewatched Ramayan with his grandparents while memorizing every line of Sita's dialogue. Sleepovers were a cultural taboo. Dating? Not until marriage. His parents didn't believe in extracurricular freedom. And while other kids were told to talk, Maulik was told to beta, study hard, and don't embarrass others. He soon learned silence was survival. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was another secret, one he didn't have the language to express. While his classmates blushed over Kelly Kapowski, Maulik felt his heart skip a beat every time Zach Morris smiled. He didn't know what it meant, only that it made him feel alive and scared at the same time. He buried it, saw it as a glitch. Something to be fixed, something unseen. In an Indian-American family in Ohio in the 1980s, there was no word for gay, only whispered warnings about those people, always followed by silence. So he became the odd kid out, a chameleon. At school, he was a polite, smart brown boy who knew all the answers but never raised his hand too high. At home, he followed the rules, never caused trouble, and was met with praise that was accompanied by a quiet pressure. Don't be different. Don't embarrass us. But inside, he was falling apart. He didn't fit in anywhere. Not quite American, not quite Indian, and certainly not comfortable with himself. There was a pain that came from constantly interpreting yourself, from presenting a version of yourself that others found more acceptable. Maulik knew that pain well. Then one day, fate intervened with a cast list. In high school, he auditioned for the school play, something melodramatic and chaotic, maybe Annie or Guys and Dolls. And when his name appeared on the list, he felt not just elated, but relieved. Rehearsals became his refuge. On stage, no one cared if his lunch smelled funny or if he'd been invited to the homecoming dance. They just wanted to see if he could say his lines and be funny, and he did. The first time he heard an audience laugh at something he did, on purpose, it felt like a switch had flipped. It wasn't just laughter, it was acceptance. It was permission. The spotlight didn't judge, the stage didn't care about ethnicity or sexual orientation. It just asked, can you tell the story? What about Maulik? He was born to do it. Acting wasn't just a hobby, it was a liberation. It gave him the space to explore all the sides of himself he couldn't express anywhere else. He could be bold, he could be tender, he could even fall in love, on stage at least. He took every play he could. He memorized monologues in secret. And somewhere between playing Romeo and perfecting a Shakespearean monologue in front of the canteen curtain, the dream took shape. What if I could do this forever? What if this wasn't just a school play, but a lifetime? But reality has its own boundaries, and they're not pretty. Indian American actors didn't exactly shine on Hollywood billboards in the 80s, unless you count Apu on The Simpsons, which, fair warning, you shouldn't. And gay actors? They either stayed quiet or disappeared. Hollywood didn't want to see people like Maulik. Not quite. Maybe as a supporting character, maybe as a comedic role. But as a leading man, as someone with a meaningful love story? No way. Maulik, though, had tasted something real, and he wasn't about to let it go. By the time he finished high school, his path was clear. Theater school, professional training. He'll become the kind of actor who doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. But even as he pursues that future, he knows the truth. To be accepted by the world he loves, he may have to continue hiding the parts of himself he holds dearest. He enters the next chapter with a suitcase full of scripts and 2 carefully hidden truths inside. He wants to be an actor, and he's gay. Only one of those 2 is allowed to take center stage. For now, at least. When Maulik Pancholy first entered Hollywood, he wasn't expecting a red carpet debut. He just wanted to get his foot in the door. And for a first-generation, dark-skinned gay Indian-American actor, even that was a miracle in the late 90s and early Huns. So, like any Broadway boy turned TV hopeful, he took what he could get, and then turned it into something unforgettable. Enter 30 Rock. Maulik didn't play the lead. He didn't play the love interest. He didn't even play someone with a last name. He played Jonathan, the loyal, slightly neurotic but wonderful assistant to Jack Donaghy, a business mogul played by Alec Baldwin. And somehow, in a cast full of Emmy winners and SNL legends, Maulik turned this small, all-consuming role into an iconic one. With his wide-eyed stares, his timely cheekiness, and his lines sharper than Jack's suit, Jonathan became a fan favorite. But while the audience was laughing, Maulik was still hiding. Behind the jokes, behind the rehearsals, behind the applause at the Emmys, there was a truth he couldn't share, not then. He was gay. He'd known it for years. But the pressure to keep quiet never really went away. Because in Hollywood, especially in that era, being openly gay wasn't considered bankable. And being brown? Well, that was too much. So he did what many people do when they feel insecure. He played it too well. He was the ideal guy for the role of the wacky best friend on television. The tech guru, the tough sidekick, the Indian American with a sharp tongue and a great sense of humor. He was everywhere. Whitney, Weeds, The Good Wife, The Good Fight. If a casting director needed someone to bring wit and variety to a 5-minute slot, Maulik's phone rang. They called him the personality actor. That was Hollywood code for, we love you, but only behind the scenes. But Maulik wasn't bitter. Not yet. He loved the job, he respected the profession, and he knew how rare it was to be there, to be present, even if only briefly. Still, something inside him itched whenever the main guy got the girl, or the story revolved around someone with a name that sounded easier to pronounce. He watched those roles pass by, like balloons floating out of reach. Sometimes, he caught himself daydreaming. What if I was the one with the love interest? What if I wasn't the funny brown guy number 3 in every script? But he pushed those thoughts aside. Because while the industry applauded his characters, he couldn't risk them turning away from who he really was. Hollywood has long had a fear of too much. Too brown, too bold, too weird. Maulik learned to avoid all three. And so he lived in what he later called voluntary invisibility. He showed up to work, gave 110%, made people laugh, and then disappeared. No red carpet interviews about his personal life. No announcement, no rainbow. Just a polite smile and a quick exit. Still, there's always gratitude. There's always perspective. Maulik knows that just being on screen, just existing as a brown gay body in the frame, even if no one knows he's gay, is a breakthrough for someone out there. Maybe a kid in Ohio like him saw 30 Rock or Weeds and thought, hey, maybe there's a place for me. He clings to that thought like a lifeline, because for all the roles that make people laugh, what he really wants is a role that allows him to be whole. But that role doesn't exist, at least not yet. So he keeps going, quietly, professionally, brilliantly. He shows up, he makes it. He builds a reputation as one of television's most reliable comedic talents. And somewhere deep inside, he began to ask himself the question that would change everything. What's the point of making people laugh if I can't even show them the real me? Have you ever felt like you had to hide a part of yourself just to be accepted? What would you do if the world loved your mask but didn't know the real you? There was a strange comfort in playing a role that everyone recognized, even if they had never actually seen him. Maulik had mastered the art of being loved without being known, of being happy while quietly bearing the burden of helplessness. He didn't hide out of shame, it was a strategy. Because in the world he lived in, visibility wasn't just a risk, it was dangerous. Yet, with every laugh he received and every compliment he received, the silence behind the scenes began to grow heavier. He began to wonder, what if success without integrity wasn't success at all? It was a clever disguise for survival. What if silence, however safe, was also a helplessness? He had built a solid, respected career on time, charm, and discipline. But now he yearned for something deeper, something that would allow him to escape his impasse. And then, quietly, without fanfare, another door began to open. Not in front of the camera, but behind the microphone. A new role awaited. And this time, it felt more like him. He didn't have the leading man's face, nor the freedom to be fully seen. But fate had something else in store. If Hollywood wouldn't embrace him on screen, maybe, just maybe, it would hear him behind the scenes. For a kid who felt invisible in Ohio, becoming a recognizable voice on global television was never part of the plan. But for Maulik Pancholy, that voice, bright, vivacious, occasionally panicky, and always on point, would soon become one of the most beloved on the Disney Channel. His name wasn't always in the spotlight, but his voice, well, it was everywhere. In the wildly popular animated series, Maulik voices Baljeet, a smart, anxious, and lovable Indian-American boy who steals the show with his nasal squeaks, science obsessions, and over-the-top existential crises about homework. For millions of kids, Baljeet is more than just a funny character. He's a role model, a brown kid who doesn't look like a stereotype, but someone you could actually sit next to in math class. It's a subtle revolution, delivered through colorful performances, melodies, and a captivating 22-minute voiceover. Baljeet doesn't have to be cool. He doesn't have to be whitewashed. He's just himself, and unapologetically. And that, in children's television, is truly groundbreaking. Behind the voice, of course, is Maulik. Still calm, still wearing multiple hats, one for the microphone, one for the producers, one for the public, one for himself. He keeps things light, warm, professional. If he ever walks into a room with a worry, he leaves it at the door. In an industry that often values diversity over comfort and silence, Maulik has learned to walk a tightrope, bold in his delivery, safe in his identity. And yet, his voice continues to resonate. His animation reputation is growing rapidly. He has voiced characters in Sanjay and Craig, Sophia the First, Sullivan and Son, and more. Casting directors know that he can create laughs, shape scenes, and bring genuine warmth to even the most eccentric characters. He has become the go-to voice actor for studios when they need someone ethnic but lovable. Someone different but not too different. And Maulik, ever gracious, delivers. His timing is impeccable. His characters are memorable. But behind the applause lies an irony. His voice is becoming iconic, while he remains invisible. Because unlike animation, real life doesn't come with rewriting the script. As Maulik sits in the dubbing booth, dark, soundproof cocoons designed to isolate sound but also unintentionally isolate the soul, he begins to ask himself questions he doesn't want to answer. Why did the world so easily fall in love with a version of me that doesn't even have a face? Baljeet can be loved. Baljeet can be awkward, weak, loud, nerdy, unashamedly Indian, and the audience cheers. But what about Maulik? Would they still cheer if they knew the man behind the microphone was gay? Would Disney still call? Would the fans still smile? Does the industry still consider him safe? There's a strange, bittersweet pain that comes from knowing that your voice is changing the world, while your truth remains hidden. He's shaping how a generation sees brown boys on screen, and yet he's too scared for them to see him in person. But something else is starting to rise. Purpose, urgency, and a growing restlessness. Because somewhere in Ohio, or Kansas, or even Mumbai, a gay kid heard Baljeet and thought, he sounds like me. A kid who didn't see himself in superheroes or teenage boys or Disney Channel lovers, but heard something in Maulik's voice that made him feel at home. That meant something. That meant everything. And it scared Maulik in the best way. He was no longer just a role, he was a lifeline. A beacon for those who felt too brown, too weak, too insignificant, or not good enough. He was still the good guy, so he kept speaking up. He kept showing up, he kept working. But the internal pressure grew with each project. The closer he got to being heard, the harder it became to hide. He began to imagine what it would be like to speak up, not as Baljeet or Sanjay or some other goofy sidekick, but as Maulik. Just Maulik. No filters, no edits. But the fear was real. He didn't want to lose what he built. He didn't want to risk his life. And most of all, he didn't want to disappoint the kids who saw him as a success story. What if coming out made things more complicated? But what if it made things more real? He'd spent so much time being the invisible voice behind unforgettable characters. But now, Maulik was asking himself the question he couldn't ignore any longer. What if the bravest thing I could do was stop pretending I didn't exist? If people love the voice we give them, do they love the truth that lies within it? Or are we all, somewhere, somehow, speaking through characters that the world finds more acceptable? For nearly 2 decades, Maulik Pancholy has built a career defined by brilliance and restraint. He's the man who takes over the stage, the voice behind the laughs, The man who makes you smile, but never lets you see the whole of him. Hollywood knew his talent. They just didn't know the truth about him. Or rather, he didn't let them see it. Until one day, in 2013, he did. There were no viral videos, no rainbow-splashed magazine covers, no tear-soaked press conferences, just a quiet, thoughtful interview in Out magazine, where Maulik, with the calm courage that only hard truths can inspire, simply said, "I'm gay." The world kept spinning, but eventually something in his soul stopped spinning. After years of playing the invisible man behind the visible characters, Maulik stepped into his true self, not as a role, not as a performance, but as a person. And he didn't come alone. Along with that revelation, he also introduced the world to his partner of many years, Ryan Corvea, a quiet, thoughtful man who has walked alongside him on red carpets, backstage corners, and dinner tables where they were just friends. But they weren't. Theirs was a love story, one that the world had never seen, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it wasn't allowed to be, until now. "I don't want to feel invisible anymore," Maulik said, and in that moment, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every gay kid who'd ever hidden his hand-holding. For all the immigrant kids who have lived between two cultures and never found room to be their true selves. For all the artists who feared that the truth would cost them opportunities. The words thundered through the silent hallways. And something remarkable happened. Hollywood didn't punish him. In fact, many people praised him. The fans who loved Jonathan from 30 Rock and Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb didn't walk away. They bowed. His colleagues cheered. Journalists called it refreshing. Casting directors called. He didn't lose his career. He expanded it. But Maulik, always thoughtful, knew that his experience wasn't the norm. Not everyone can come out and be greeted with applause. Not everyone has the luxury of security, of a career that's secure enough to take the risk. And that's why his coming out wasn't just personal, it was political. Because when someone like Maulik, a first-generation queer brown American actor, said, "This is who I am," he opened a door for others to come in. Suddenly, young actors in Hollywood who looked like him, who loved like him, no longer felt alone. He became a symbol not of perfection, but of possibility. He wasn't the most famous face in Hollywood, but for a growing, peaceful community of queer artists of color, he was a beacon. And he didn't stop there. Maulik began speaking out, publicly, forcefully, and deliberately, about intersectionality, about the diverse experiences of being LGBTQ+ and South Asian in America. He reminded people that presence isn't a one-size-fits-all. Culture, family, language, religion, all of these things shape how a person can live out their true self, and that the conversation about queerness in America has to make room for stories like his. He started appearing on panels, in schools, on college campuses. He spoke about bullying, about representation, about not seeing anyone like himself on screen when he was growing up. And he challenged Hollywood to do better, to write more inclusive stories, to cast more queer actors of color, to stop making diversity a catch-all term. Through it all, he was Maulik, humble, warm, wickedly funny, but now, finally, fully complete. His love for Ryan had become something to be celebrated, not hidden. In 2014, they married in a quiet but joyous ceremony at the Taj Mahal in India, a poetic celebration of both love and heritage. Two men, two cultures, one promise, to love and live openly. Maulik never intended to be an icon, but by speaking his truth, he became what Hollywood needed more than any superhero franchise. A real, complex, funny human being who lived his true self and thrived. And perhaps most powerful of all, he never saw coming out as an act of rebellion. He saw it as an act of belonging, finally stepping into the world as his true self. If Maulik's story resonates with you, please support this channel. A like, a share, or even an honest comment will help more voices rise from the silence. This story isn't just about one actor. It's about anyone who has ever been asked to hide in order to be accepted. Love that lives in truth isn't scandalous or a sideline. It's brave, it's beautiful, and it deserves to be seen. So tell us, what does love mean to you when it's finally free? We'd love to hear your voices. Coming out wasn't the end of Maulik Pancholy's story. It was the beginning of a new, bolder, more powerful chapter. When the curtain of silence was lifted, Maulik didn't just stand. He spoke up louder. And he spoke up not just for himself, but for all those who still feel voiceless in the shadows of culture, fear, or expectation. And people listened. In 2014, just a year after coming out, President Barack Obama appointed Maulik to the White House Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, AAPI. It wasn't just a political gesture, it was recognition. A recognition that being gay and being black are not mutually exclusive identities. That a man who had spent years on the sidelines of sitcoms and cartoons now had a seat at the table where real decisions were being made. Maulik to that table what no policy could produce: empathy, lived experience, and a deep understanding of how invisibility shapes lives. And he didn't waste a moment. He began visiting schools and colleges, talking to students about bullying, gender identity, and the dangerous silence that often surrounds queer youth, especially those of Asian descent. In gyms, lecture halls, and small classrooms, he looked into the eyes of kids who reminded him of his younger self, bright, scared, eager to be seen, and he told them what he needed to hear. You are good enough. You are you, and your story deserves to be shared. But he didn't stop at speeches. In 2019, Maulik published a novel called The Best at It, a middle-grade story about Rahul Kapoor, a smart, anxious Indian-American boy navigating first loves, cultural expectations, and the terrifying and beautiful possibility that he might be gay. The book wasn't just fiction. It was therapy. It was testimony. It was everything Maulik had kept quiet about, now in black and white for the world to read. And the world took notice. The Best at It was named a Stonewall Honor Book, celebrated by educators, librarians, and LGBTQ+ advocates as one of the most honest, tender, and inspiring works of its kind. For many young readers, it was the first time they'd seen someone like themselves not just exist, but thrive on the page. It was Maulik's voice, no longer hidden behind a cartoon, no longer confined to a supporting character. This time, it spoke directly to the hearts of children in need of a lifeline. But Maulik wasn't done yet. He returned to the stage, where it all began, with a new purpose. In Broadway and off-Broadway productions, he took on roles that truly reflected his personality. Complex characters with flaws, desires, fears. No longer confined to the image of the funny Indian friend, he lived in stories that allowed him to be fully himself. Sometimes the audience cried, sometimes they laughed, but always they saw him. And in those moments, something sacred happened. Maulik finally captured the hearts of the audience, not just as a performer, but as a person. He may not have been the blockbuster movie star that Hollywood once promised. He may never have been the lead in an action series or graced the cover of People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. But in every meaningful way, Maulik has become a leading man. A leading man for authenticity. A leading man for kids still searching for their voices. A leading man for queer people of color who are shaping a world that often tells them to choose one identity or hide the other. He didn't just break barriers, he rewrote the image of success outside the spotlight. And in doing so, he gave the next generation permission to dream differently. Because Maulik knew something that most of Hollywood has forgotten. Being noticed isn't about being famous. It's about being authentic. He wasn't at the center of every story, but rather at the edge, waving the flag for those who were still afraid to step in. And maybe that's what makes him a rare kind of hero. The kind who doesn't lead with ego, but with empathy. The kind who doesn't wait for permission, but uses his truth to create permission for others. If you believe that showing your true self can inspire others to do the same, then you're already part of a movement. Whose voice makes you feel seen? Or rather, whose story are you brave enough to tell? Maulik Pancholy never set out to become an icon. He didn't chase headlines, scandals, or social media fame. What he pursued, quietly, doggedly, was the truth. And in a city built on illusions, that may be the bravest journey of all. Because sometimes, legacies aren't created in the spotlight. They're created in the silence of applause. the kind that echoes in children's hearts long after the stage has been turned off. By the time the world finally saw Maulik for who he really was, brown, gay, talented, whole, he had spent decades becoming that person in silence. And perhaps that's why his legacy resonates more than most. Because it's not made by media people or award speeches, but by choosing to be authentic over and over again, even when no one is looking. He didn't need to be on the cover of Vanity Fair to matter. He mattered in school gyms, in whispered conversations in hallways, in the quiet courage of a gay South Asian boy who read the best at it and finally breathed a sigh of relief. He mattered to teachers looking for better stories to share, to casting directors who were starting to see more than stereotypes, and to gay kids of color growing up in Ohio or Queens or Bangkok who realized that someone like them had made it. Maulik's career was anything but conventional. He didn't become a blockbuster star or a romantic lead in a mainstream TV series, but he became the link between two seemingly irreconcilable worlds, heritage and queerness. For years, Hollywood told actors a choice, be brown or be gay, but not both. Maulik said, "Look at me." And he did it with grace, humor, and brutal honesty. What began as theatrical monologues whispered into a mirror has become something much bigger. From Jonathan in 30 Rock to Baljit in Phineas and Ferb, from major speeches to Stonewall award-winning novels, he has built a mosaic of identities that defies categorization. He has played the fun friend, the nerdy genius, the anxious kid, and ultimately, the advocate. But behind each role lies a deeper message. You don't have to hide. In many ways, Maulik's life has become the story he never saw growing up. Not one of instant success or activism, but of slow, steady revolution. Of choosing to stay, to speak, to write, to act, to be. He has inspired voices like Bowen Yang, Telly Leung, and countless others not just through representation, but through recognition. He has helped them exist more fully in an industry that once saw them as a risk. And that's the magic of quiet impact. It doesn't beg for attention. It creates space for others to thrive, for communities to thrive, for stories to finally be told in their fullest form. Maulik reminds us that you don't have to be at the center to change culture. Sometimes you just have to be real, long enough for others to see themselves through your eyes. So let's ask a bold question. What if the most powerful reputation was being remembered for how you made others feel seen? Maulik didn't wait for Hollywood to give him a platform. He built his own, with words, voice, courage, and fierce love. Not just love for acting, but love for the outsiders, love for the people in between, love for the version of himself that once felt too Indian, too strange, too invisible to matter. And maybe that's why this story matters so much, because it's not just about career milestones or magazine articles, it's about emotional legacy, the kind that lingers long after the movie ends. The kind that changes how a generation defines success, belonging, and truth. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't break down any doors or demand attention. He simply showed up, steadfast, compassionate, and clear, with a voice that refused to disappear. In doing so, he became exactly the kind of person that young Maulik had once needed. Someone to believe in, someone to follow. And just by living out loud, he rewrote the script, not just for himself, but for every kid who'd ever been told to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay unseen. At one point, Maulik asked the question that had haunted him for years. What's the point of making people laugh if I can't even show them the real me? And now, we know the answer. The real Maulik, unfiltered, vulnerable, true, made us feel less alone. He showed us that gentleness is its own form of strength, that showing up is enough, and that authenticity, when lived fully and fearlessly, is the bravest act of all. So as we close this chapter, let's not just remember him as an actor, an author, or an activist. Let's remember him as a license plate, a living reminder that you don't need a flashing light to change your life. Sometimes all it takes is a whisper of truth, spoken loud enough to reach someone who is still hiding in the shadows. To you, the one watching, you don't have to be famous to make a difference. You just have to be brave enough to be seen. And Maulik Pancholy, he didn't just act, he amplified. Thank you for being a part of this story. Maulik Pancholy turned silence into power and gave a voice to those who never felt seen. If his journey resonates with you, hold on to it, share it. Because every time we spread stories like his, the world becomes a little more real, more human. Stay tuned for more untold stories that matter. Your support helps these voices be heard. Can you believe this actually happened in America? At the age of 5, George Takei was sent to a concentration camp with his family, simply because of their heritage. From barbed wire to Broadway, from quiet to strong, his journey is about more than just surviving. It's about rising up, reclaiming, and leading with pride. This is a story about turning pain into purpose and speaking up when the world tells you to be quiet. Stay tuned until the end, because George's story might just help you find your own. What does it mean to be rejected by the country of your birth? Not ignored, not overlooked, actively rejected. You'd expect this story to come from a war-torn dictatorship, but it happened in America. George Takei was born in Los Angeles in 1937, a smiling, curious boy raised in a modest home by two hardworking Japanese immigrant parents. His father ran a dry cleaners. His mother took care of the house. They believed in this country. They believed in democracy. They paid taxes, waved the American flag, and named their son George in honor of King George VI of England. But patriotism could not protect them, especially when fear set in. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, hysteria spread like wildfire. Politicians called Japanese Americans potential spies. Newspapers ran racist cartoons. Neighbors turned cold. And then the order was issued, Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. With a single signature, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were forced from their homes and deemed a threat to national security. George was only 5 years old. Can you imagine being 5 years old and seeing soldiers marching to your doorstep? Watching your parents panic, rushing to pack up what little they had? The fear in their eyes, the silence that filled the room, the unanswered questions. George's family was loaded onto trains like cattle, first taken to an internment camp at a horse racing track in Santa Anita. They were forced to live in stables. The smell of manure still lingered. Flies buzzed. The floors were hard, the walls thin. George didn't understand why they were there, but he knew it wasn't home. From there, they were taken across the country to the Broadway Resettlement Center, in the middle of the Arkansas swamps, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, armed soldiers, and then Tule Lake, one of the harshest prison camps for families who refused to swear unconditional allegiance to a country that had imprisoned them without trial. Tell me, how do you explain that to a child? That you're not free, that you've been imprisoned by the land of the free, that you've done nothing wrong, but your face is enough to scare people. George remembers it all. The dust, the heat, the humiliation, waiting in food lines, showering in communal bathrooms, sleeping in uninsulated barracks, snow in the winter, mosquitoes in the summer. He remembers looking through the bars of his window and seeing a man in uniform standing with a rifle, pointed inside. But what sticks with him most is his father's calm. Mr. Takei never let the camp shake his spirit. He read the Constitution aloud to his children. He organized community events. He told George as a young boy, "You are an American. And being an American means you have to stand up. You have to speak up. Even if the country forgets its own promises, you don't forget who you are." That message resonated throughout George's life. Because let's be honest, this was more than just a camp. This was the birthplace of George Takei's political consciousness. This is where he first tasted injustice, where he first understood the dangers of silence, where he learned that looking different could erase your rights in an instant. But he didn't grow up angry. He grew up sober, determined, realistic. In time, he would become one of the first openly gay Asian Americans in Hollywood, a powerful voice for justice. But before the spotlight, before Star Trek, before the thunderous applause, there was a boy in the barn, wondering why his country didn't want him, and that boy never forgot. But childhood doesn't last forever. and neither do fences. When the war ends, the barbed wire comes down, but the damage is done. George emerges from the camp not as a victim, but as a witness. A witness to what fear can justify and what silence can destroy. And so, as the country tries to forget what it did, George begins to remember with purpose. Because the boy who once slept in the barn is about to step onto a stage much bigger than he ever imagined. That's where our story picks up, in a post-war America still haunted by its past, and a Japanese-American boy determined to rewrite the script he's been given. So now I want to ask you, what do you carry with you from your childhood? A favorite toy? A lullaby? A scar? And if your earliest memory was locked away by your government, would you still believe in its promise? George Takei believed, and because of that, he helped shape a better version of ourselves. What do you do when your very existence feels like a contradiction? George Takei didn't just walk into Hollywood, he walked into a world that had no blueprint for someone like him. As a Japanese American, fresh out of UCLA's theater program, armed with a knowledge of Shakespeare and classical ambitions, he should have belonged there. But instead of being welcomed by stages, he found doors slammed shut and mirrors that reflected only the roles others wanted him to play. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had to shrink yourself just to be noticed? That was George's daily reality. On paper, he was everything an actor should be: smart, charismatic, disciplined. But in real life, casting directors saw only the surface, the slanted eyes, the otherness, the scars of a war his community had been forced to endure. Hollywood didn't want a complicated Asian lead. They wanted shadows, villains, sidekicks, funny lines. His early roles were embarrassingly simple: a brutal Japanese officer torturing prisoners, a thick-accented, nameless taxi driver, a serving boy bowing in the background while white characters narrated. And George? He played the part. Because what other choice did he have? And there was another, even deeper secret he was carrying. Behind the costumes and the spotlight, George was simply a young man with a quiet truth. In 1950s America, that truth was not only misunderstood, it was considered unacceptable. To be different in the way you love meant to risk everything, reputation, even safety. For someone who had struggled to be seen in a world that no longer recognized Asian faces, adding another layer of difference seemed impossible. Not just difficult, but almost unbearable. How do you find your voice when just hearing it can cost you everything? So George retreated, again. Forced to live in the shadows, he wore not one but two masks, one to show his face to the world and one to hide the love that lived quietly in his chest. Can you imagine that kind of erasure? Not just being pushed out of society, but being pushed into silence within yourself? While other actors struggled with close-ups and auditions, George struggled to make a living. He had to overact, overtalk, overpromise, all to play roles that barely touched the surface of who he was. And at night, he walked alone, unable to share his truth with anyone in the business. No shoulder to lean on, no lover's hand to hold in public, just silence. And yet, he stayed. Why? Because somewhere, deep down, he believed that the business could be better. That art could open doors where policy had built walls, that if he could get in, he could help others find their way. Then came 1966. When George got the call about Star Trek, he had no idea that it would mark a turning point, not just in his career, but in how the world viewed him. The show had yet to become a phenomenon. In fact, many expected it to quietly fizzle out. But something was different. The creators had dared to imagine a future that looked exactly like the rest of us. And for the first time, George wasn't asked to change his voice. He wasn't given a role that would vanish before it began. He wasn't there as a symbol of fear or humor. He was there as a bridge to the future. He was Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu, a helmsman, a leader, a smart, calm man. On the USS Enterprise, George wasn't just steering a ship, he was breaking the sound barrier of representation. But let's be honest, the uniform didn't take away the pain. Even as one of the first Asian faces on primetime television, George still had to hide, still dodged dating questions, still had to watch his every word in interviews. Coming out wasn't an option. Not yet. That's the paradox of early exposure. It can put you on screen, but it also keeps you at a certain distance from real presence. So what do you cling to when the spotlight is on you, but never really touches you? For George, the answer was discipline, skill, a quiet belief that if he couldn't fully inhabit his voice, he could at least fully inhabit his work. Excellence became his rebellion, his way of blazing a trail where none existed. And in that quiet journey, he left the door a little wider for those who would follow. Years later, he reflected, "I lived two lives, one for them, one for me." So here's my question to you. Can you imagine how exhausting that must have been? Laughing on set while choking in silence, watching your character boldly go where no man had gone before, while you, an actor, couldn't even date without fear? That's the hidden story of George Takei's early career, not just science fiction or fame. It's about overcoming the devastating loneliness of being too alienated from white Hollywood and too gay for the world around him. But George never gave up, because he wasn't chasing fame, he was searching for a place to belong. And as he continued, that quiet search would grow into something bigger than himself, into a purpose, into a presence, into a voice that carried weight. Follow along with us, because George Takei's story will not be forgotten. It will rise again, strong and powerful, as a voice finally heard. What is the price of being seen but not known? George Takei bravely went where no Asian American had gone before, and yet he couldn't tell the world who he really was. It all started with Star Trek. In 1966, as the USS Enterprise made television history, George played Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu, a calm, sharp-tongued navigator who broke every stereotype Hollywood had imposed on Asian actors for decades. No broken English, no martial arts, no meek bows or slapstick. Sulu was strong, stern, and completely human. And for millions watching at home, it was the first time they'd seen an Asian face portrayed without being stereotyped. Do you remember the first time you felt truly represented? For many, George was that moment. But even as the world applauded, George carried a truth he could not share. The irony was stifling. On screen, he explored distant galaxies. Off screen, he could not even explore the basic human right to love. Publicly. As Star Trek grew into a phenomenon, George became a fixture in American pop culture. He voiced characters in animated films, performed Shakespeare and musicals on stage, and guest starred on shows like The $6 Million Man, Murder, She Wrote, MacGyver. His schedule was packed, but his heart was always hidden. For nearly 4 decades, he carefully navigated questions about his personal life. Journalists asked about marriage, dating, family. He gave charming, tactful answers, always warm, always vague, and behind closed doors the truth remained. George Takei was a gay man in a world not yet ready for that statement. The 1970s and 1980s were not only professionally productive, they were also personally stifling. He saw his stage and film colleagues whispering rumors, avoiding certain bars, taking precautions that straight actors never had to consider. He saw others exposed and blacklisted. He saw the Reagan-era silence about AIDS. He saw fear weaponized, and he remained silent. Have you ever had to hide your joy just to stay safe? Then in 1987, everything changed. George met Brad Altman. Brad was not a co-star or an activist. He was a marathon runner, a writer, a soft-spoken, kind man with steady eyes and a genuine smile. Their relationship started quietly, but quickly deepened. For the first time, George felt a love that wasn't just fun. It was safe, nurturing, honest, but not public. Because for the next 18 years, George and Brad built a life together in silence. They lived under the same roof, traveled the world, read scripts together, celebrated birthdays together, endured loss together, cooked together, but never held hands in front of strangers. When Brad attended events with George, he was introduced as an assistant, a friend, an errand boy, completely different from who he really was. Can you imagine that? Loving someone for nearly 2 decades and then pretending they didn't exist? It weighed on George, quietly but deeply. Each public victory brought its own pain. He would stand before crowds, make eloquent speeches about justice, only to retreat behind the scenes, living a life where he could not name the man who had fought alongside him. He fought for human rights, but never for his own. He stood for the truth, but let his own truth be hidden. And yet, through it all, he endured. Not because he lacked courage, but because he was patient. He believed that change was possible, that one day the world would catch up, that his voice, when it was finally raised, would matter. He watched society move forward in slow, painful steps. He watched Ellen come out in 1997 and lose everything. He watched Will and Grace make waves, but always with veiled humor. He watched friends die without ever telling anyone who they loved. And he waited, and all the while he asked himself the same painful question. How could I be a symbol of justice while remaining a recluse? That contradiction gnawed at him. Because George was no ordinary person. He was Sulu. He was a voice of resistance. He spoke out about the Japanese-American internment camps, about racism, about being discriminated against in your own country. But this part of you, it's still unspoken. On quiet nights, Brad would say softly, "When the time comes, you'll know." And George held on to those words, through the fear, through the silence, through the weight of the years. So now I ask you, what will you do? Will you risk everything you've worked for just to be who you are? Or will you wait, hoping the world will change, even as your silence shapes your story? Because George waited, he kept his truth, for his career, for his future, for something he believed was bigger than himself. But here's what makes his story different. When George finally decided to speak up, it wasn't for applause, it wasn't for headlines. He spoke up for one reason: love. And soon, that love became the center of attention, because the world was finally beginning to understand George Takei. And now when he speaks up, it's not just with words, it's with conviction. Watch. The silence is over, and his real voice, it's just beginning. What makes a man approaching 70, who has built a career on silence, finally decide to speak up? For George Takei, it's not about attention, it's not about recognition, it's about love. And it's about justice. At 68, he's breaking decades of silence, not to rewrite the past, but to honor his truth. Because there are truths that grow louder over time, and eventually they demand to be heard. By 2005, George had lived many lives. He was a Star Trek legend, a concentration camp survivor, a quiet cultural icon, a man who once walked red carpets with an increasingly heavy secret. For years, he kept his private life private. Not because he was ashamed, but because the world wasn't ready. Hollywood certainly wasn't ready, and maybe he wasn't either. But that year, something snapped. California passed a historic bill that would have legalized same-sex marriage. But Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, ironically, once a symbol of heroism, vetoed it. For George, it wasn't political, it was personal. Because behind the scenes, George was not alone. For nearly 2 decades, he had shared his life with Brad Altman, a true partner. Together, they had built something rare, a safe haven filled with books, laughter, and the kind of peace that only deep, lasting love can create. But that love, so strong and true, was once again threatened, challenged by norms that didn't accept it, rejected by systems that tried to erase it. And then George did what few expected, a man of his generation, background, and career. He stepped forward, and he showed the world who he truly was. "I am a gay man," he announced in an interview with Frontiers, a leading LGBTQ+ magazine in Los Angeles. And with those 5 simple words, he broke decades of silence. A voice once known for its performance now held something deeper: belief. What was once entertainment now stood for something, for truth, for presence, for resistance. The press didn't see it coming. A Japanese-American actor, known for his quiet strength, quiet charisma, and iconic roles in sci-fi, spoke with a sincerity that cut through the noise. Asian-American media representation was already rare. An openly gay Asian man? Almost unheard of. But George didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, clear, steady, and unflinching, and standing right next to him was Brad. He didn't speak out for attention. He spoke out because the moment called for it. Because after a lifetime of waiting, the truth was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be celebrated. Let me ask you, how much courage does it take to risk everything you've built? just to live in the light. George had seen silence. He had seen it in World War II, behind barbed wire. He had seen it in Hollywood casting rooms. He had seen it when friends whispered about who they were behind closed doors. And now, finally, he had chosen something else. Visibility. And the world listened. LGBTQ+ communities across the country celebrated his courage. Allies stopped and took notice. For many queer Asians, especially those of older generations, George became more than a role model. He became a reminder that it's never too late to be authentic. That you don't have to be young or trendy or perfect to make a difference. You just have to be authentic. And then, 3 years later, the opportunity to make it official came. In May 2008, when same-sex marriage was provisionally legalized in California, George didn't hesitate. He asked Brad to marry him. And that September, surrounded by friends, family, and decades of quiet marriage, they said "I do" at the Japanese National Museum in Los Angeles, a place that had honored their past and now witnessed their future. It was tender. It was powerful. Two men, Asian, in love, witnessed, celebrated, and finally, made official. Brad wore a cream tuxedo, George wore white. Together they walked down the aisles, surrounded by family, friends, community leaders, and generations of quiet hope. The ceremony was deeply symbolic, not just of who they were, but of where they stood. A museum built on the memory of injustice, now awaiting a moment of liberation. During the vows, George's voice shook, not with fear, but with release. 71 years of repression finally gave way. I have never felt more whole than I do today, he said. And in that sentence, you could feel the decades crumbling away. The captive boy, the reticent actor, the silent partner, they all stood together at the altar, free at last. And have you ever witnessed a love so enduring that it transcended the quiet years, transcended barriers, transcended time itself? Their wedding was broadcast on national television. Their photos were shown around the world. And their kiss, tender, blissful, unwavering, became more than a moment. It became a symbol, not just a testament to how far we've come, but a testament to what's always possible. Of what happens when two people choose to love, fully, openly, and without regret. No matter where they come from, no matter who they are. George and Brad became the first openly gay Asian American couple to legally marry in Los Angeles. But more than that, they became proof. Proof that storytelling isn't just what you do on screen, it's how you live when no one's writing your script. So as they walked hand in hand into the future, something fundamental changed. Not just for them, for their country, for their community. For all those who had been waiting like George, for a sign that the fight was worth it. And that's where the next begins. Because once George found his voice, he never looked back. He became a beacon. Bold, brilliant, and unshakably honest, an inescapable source of humor, strength, and purpose. But before we get to that, let me ask you this. Have you ever been loved so deeply, so completely, that it gave you the courage to stand firm, speak out louder, and maybe even change the world? How to turn a childhood filled with barriers into a future filled with freedom. How to turn the pain that once humbled you into a platform that lifts others up. For George Takei, the answer has always been, you remember, so the world doesn't forget. You speak up so others can breathe, and you stand up so the next generation doesn't have to kneel in shame. By the 2010s, George had broken more than his fair share of barriers. He came out as gay, he found love openly, and he found his voice again after decades of silence. But for George, that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of his second act. Or perhaps his most powerful performance yet. It all started with Allegiance, a Broadway musical born from the darkest corners of his childhood. Memories of armed guards, cold winter nights, and the silent pain of a father trying to keep his family together. George poured his heart into that stage. Have you ever seen someone turn generational trauma into applause? That's what Allegiance did. It wasn't just a performance, it was a confrontation with America's conscience. And through that confrontation, audiences cried, stood up, remembered, and they learned. But George didn't stop there. If the stage could reach hundreds, the page could reach millions. He published his memoir, To the stars, not as a story of fame, but as a map of survival. Then came They Called Us Enemy, a graphic novel about his time in the camps, designed to educate young minds. And it worked. Schools across the country assigned him to read. Parents read with their children. Librarians kept his books on file. When was the last time you saw a comic start a national debate about civil rights? George did it with just ink, memory, and an unshakable truth. And just when the world thought George had left his mark, he did what few dared. He reinvented himself. At 70, George Takei has become a digital phenomenon. Not a fad, not a joke, a true voice of the internet age. His classic line, "Oh my gosh," has become more than a laugh. It has become a beacon of unexpected joy, of aging gracefully and humorously, of sharp wisdom wrapped in irresistible charm. Across platforms, tens of millions have tuned in, not just to smile, but to think. Have you ever followed someone online because they made you feel seen, smarter, braver? That's the impact George has had. He's turned Facebook into a learning space, Twitter into a place of meaningful exchange, Instagram into a place of pride, of generational connection. And with every post, every witty caption, every carefully curated meme, he sent a message that resonates loud and clear. Queer elders matter. Asian voices matter. Authenticity matters. But George never let the spotlight be focused on himself. Instead, he used it to shine a light on others. He became a vocal advocate for the trans community when many remained silent. He championed mental health support for LGBTQ+ youth through his work with the Trevor Project. He stood with groups like GLAAD, the Human Rights Campaign, and countless others. And he showed up, not just in interviews and appearances, but at protests and marches, not just in editorials, but in the streets. In 2015, a deeply symbolic moment occurred. The Japanese government awarded George the Order of the Rising Sun, one of the country's highest civilian honors, for his contributions to the arts and his lifelong efforts to build bridges between Japan and the United States. For George, a man who had lived behind barbed wire it was a powerful act of recognition and healing. Imagine, a boy imprisoned by history, now honored by a country that had once been far away. But even in moments of recognition, George remains focused as always, on the people. Because he doesn't just share his story, he opens the door for others to share theirs. To a small-town LGBTQ+ teen, confused and scared, George is proof that pride has no limits. It may come late, but it shines brightly. To an immigrant child feeling lost, George whispers, "You are not the background. You are the story." To an adult wondering if it's too late to make a mark, George reminds us, your voice is still waiting. And it's never too late to use it. So let me ask you, have you ever known someone who grew stronger with age and gentler with strength? That was George Takei, a man who didn't rewrite history. He gave it a voice, not by forgetting the past, but by ensuring that it was remembered honestly and told carefully. George Takei's story is not a story of the past. It is still being written with clarity, courage, and quiet strength. George Takei never set out to be a hero. He never set out to be an icon for Asian Americans or a voice for the LGBTQ+ community. He simply lived, honestly, bravely, and unapologetically. And in a world that often to silence him, George chose to speak up, not just louder, but clearer, with purpose. And over time, that voice became something bigger than him. It became a light for others still searching for their own. George's life has been about more than overcoming adversity. It's about helping others wake up. Every time he shares a part of his journey, growing up behind barbed wire, playing roles that never reflected who he was, loving quietly in the dark, he's not just reliving the past, he's giving us something, a light to keep us going. Have you ever felt like being true to yourself might come at a high price? That if you just stay quiet, if you just blend in, maybe you'll be accepted? It was the silent lie George grew up with. That silence meant safety. That fitting in was a form of freedom. That love was only worth living when no one could see it. But he chose a different path, to live fully, openly, and without regret. When George came out in 2005, he was a household name, a beloved actor, a trusted voice, But he knew that to be silent meant turning his back, not just on himself, but on the millions still waiting to be seen, still wondering if they were alone. So he stood up, not with anger, but with grace, humor, and the kind of strength that only comes from deep pain turned to purpose. He didn't just share his story, he invited us to join him, and in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. Bowen Yang, the first Chinese-American cast member on Saturday Night Live, once said that he never thought it was possible to be gay and Asian on a mainstream stage until he saw George. Telly Leung, the lead of Allegiance on Broadway, called him a warrior in a gentleman's body. Nico Santos, the star of Superstore, said that George's fame showed him that joy and queerness could coexist in an Asian body. These men and so many others didn't just admire George, they saw themselves in him. Because George created space in a world where difference didn't exist. He proved that being different doesn't mean being alone. And he taught us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. Let's be honest, America hasn't always made room for strong Asian voices, for fearless gay joy, or for people brave enough to speak truths. But George never asked for permission. He created space where none existed. He told the stories others were too afraid to tell. And he carried his past, the pain, the wounds, not as a burden that held him back, but as fuel to keep moving forward. Not with bitterness, but with purpose, with fire. Even in his 80s, George kept showing up. He marched, he spoke before Congress, he shared his truth online with wit and warmth. He hugged fans, held signs, kept his distance when necessary, and held hands when it mattered most. And perhaps it was in that final image, the quiet act of reaching out to shake someone's hand, that his most powerful message remained. Picture this, a sea of protesters filling the streets, young and old, gay and straight, Asian, black, brown, and every shade of courage in between. Flags flying, drums pounding, voices rising in unison calling for justice. And at the center of it all, walking silently and steadily, were George and Brad, his husband, his partner, witnessing the moment they had both waited their entire lives to witness. They didn't lead the chants. They simply walked, hand in hand, not in defiance, but in silent celebration, no regrets, just presence, just love, together. In that moment, they were simply two men, two lights burning steadily, two quiet reminders that love, when lived fully and fearlessly, can overcome any challenge. You don't need a spotlight to be brave. You don't need applause to be important. You just have to show up, like George did. This is the story of George Takei, a boy who was once shut out by fences, grew into a man who opened doors with his voice. He didn't just act, he inspired. He didn't just talk, he lifted. And in choosing to live authentically, he gave others permission to do the same. George Takei didn't just survive. He showed us how to live with purpose, with pride, and without fear. George Takei's story is a reminder. Even when the world tries to silence you, your voice can change lives. Thanks for watching. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more meaningful stories on our channel. And for our most thoughtful viewers, what does this story mean to you? Leave your thoughts in the comments. See you next time. Until then, stay proud, stay true, and stay strong. He was the dream guy on TV, shirtless, smiling, and straight, or so we thought. But what if the real love story was never on screen? What if the man behind that perfect smile was quietly rewriting Hollywood history, one truth at a time? This is the journey of Vincent Rodriguez III, a gay Filipino actor who turned rejection into revolution and proved that being yourself can be the most powerful role of all. Vincent Rodriguez III was born in 1982 in downtown San Francisco, the youngest of 4 children in a family shaped by the love, discipline, and quiet resilience of Filipino immigrants. His parents, like many who left their homeland for America, came here with suitcases full of dreams and a quiet sacrifice. They settled in Daly City, a smog and concrete enclave just south of San Francisco, affectionately known as Little Manila. But even here, where Asian grocery stores pop up on every corner and Tagalog echoes through living rooms, Vincent feels he doesn't quite belong. He is the youngest of 4 children, with 3 older sisters who often act as his mother while their parents go to work. The house was loud, warm, and filled with routine. Catholic prayers before dinner, weekend chores, and be good, work hard were ingrained in the rhythm of everyday life. But even in this tight-knit world, Vincent stood out. Not in a rebellious way, in spirit. While his cousins ran amok in the backyard and played basketball on the cracked sidewalk, Vincent stayed inside, spinning around, grooving to the tunes of Aladdin. He couldn't yet put it into words, but even as a child, he knew he was different. His sisters found it endearing, the way he imitated Lea Salonga's voice with uncanny accuracy or choreographed dances to Disney soundtracks. But outside the family circle, the world wasn't always so kind. Classmates teased him, teachers sometimes questioned his behavior. And though no one said it outright, the message was clear: boys weren't supposed to move like that, or sing like that, or dream like that. He tried to fit in. He played the part of the good son, the good student, the smiling friend. But there was a quiet tension lurking inside, an inner voice that whispered, "This isn't who you are." At school, you studied hard. At home, you played the part that was expected of you. But when you were alone, really alone, you came alive. In the privacy of your bedroom, you became a star. Not in the way the world measured fame, but in the way a lonely child finds light in dark corners. You didn't just watch musicals, you immersed yourself in them. You didn't pretend, you were becoming yourself. But even as your imagination soared, reality often clouded your wings. He didn't see anyone like himself on television. No gay Filipino boys falling in love, leading stories, or dancing fearlessly in the spotlight. Representation wasn't just scarce, it was non-existent. And without mirrors, it was hard to know what you looked like. Harder still to believe you mattered. There were moments of silence that hurt more than the insults. Teachers passed him over for leading roles. Friends shunned him. Adults tried, with good intentions, to steer him towards safer dreams. And while his family loved him, they didn't always understand him. How could they? They were doing their best to survive in a country that had never truly welcomed them. His passion for art often felt like a luxury in a world that demanded practicality. Yet he persisted. With music, with movement, with a fire inside that never went out, no matter how many times it was ignored. "I always knew I wanted to be noticed," he once said. "But I didn't know if the world was ever ready for me." That's what makes his story so powerful. Not just his rise to stardom, but also his years in the shadows. The child inside who danced when no one was looking. The child who believed in something bigger, even when the world gave him no evidence of its existence. For so many LGBTQ+ kids of color, growing up means learning to survive invisibility, dreaming in silence, pretending until the pretense becomes unbearable. Vincent was one of those kids. A gay Filipino boy in an America that had no place for him. And yet he took something to heart, in the spotlight, in the applause of Broadway. Before Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and the magazine covers, there was just one guy in Daly City, spinning around alone in his living room, hoping that someday someone would notice, that someone would see him. And maybe, just maybe, that someone might be him. New York City doesn't hold your hand, especially not when you're a short, brown, soft-spoken Filipino boy who dreams of getting on Broadway with no roadmap. But Vincent Rodriguez III didn't come to the city for comfort. He came here to pursue something bigger, a future lit by the spotlight, not defined by stereotypes. And to do that, he enrolled at the American Musical and Dramatic Academy, a place known for turning ambition into skill and talent into survival. At AMDA, Vincent didn't just learn to act. He honed his voice, honed his movements, and pushed his body to limits most people never thought possible. 6 days a week, singing, dancing, tumbling, failing, then trying again. He didn't come from a wealthy family. He came from Daly City, and he came with a hunger that you can't teach in a classroom. Every note he sang, every step he took, every scene he rehearsed, it was a tiny rebellion against every voice that told him he wasn't man enough, not American enough, not proper. When he graduated, the real test began. Broadway didn't welcome him with open arms. But Vincent found his way in, not through the front door, but through relentless persistence and tenacity. He landed roles in White Christmas, Pippin, Xanadu, Anything Goes, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and, most memorably, Here Lies Love, a daring off-Broadway musical inspired by the life of Imelda Marcos. The play, rooted in Filipino history, was more than just a show. It was the first time Vincent felt his culture was celebrated, not hidden. He was no longer trying to fit a mold. He brought himself, his whole self, to the stage, and audiences noticed. But for every round of applause, 100 doors closed. When Vincent started working on television, the old rules crumbled. He wasn't what casting directors envisioned. They wanted leading men. He was too brown, too short, too soft, too Asian, too different, and yet he persisted. His first TV appearance was a small role on the Onion News Network in 2011. Blink and you'll miss him. Then came Hostages in 2014, another small role, and then Donnie 2015, a tap show host, little more than a footnote in someone else's story. But for Vincent, every moment in front of the camera matters, because every moment whispers a simple but dangerous idea. Maybe this could happen. And yet the industry is ruthless. He sits in casting rooms where he can feel the judgment before he utters a word. He knows when he's not getting a part, not because of his acting, but because of the face he was born with. His white friends? They've been called back. They've gotten the lead. Vincent gets a thank you in silence, painful. Not because he believes he's not good enough, but because deep down, he knows he is. He's trained, he has a voice, he has range, but he also has skin that doesn't match the image on the poster. A name that doesn't sound American, and not an alpha male. There were nights when he sat in his small New York apartment, staring at the ceiling, asking himself questions no young actor should ever ask. Is there room for someone like me? Am I just fooling myself? He would go to auditions, smile, shake hands, and then walk out thinking they hadn't seen him. Not really. They saw a box he didn't fit into, and they slammed the lid shut. But that's what made Vincent different. He didn't stop. He went back to the dance studio, back to his voice, back to work. Because even if the world hadn't seen it yet, he was still a leading man. And he knew that the only way to make room for someone like him was to stand there until the door opened. He didn't wait for permission. He was preparing for that moment. Every rejection became motivation. Every no became a silent promise to himself that he wouldn't let the system determine his worth. And through it all, he kept showing up. Every episode, every line. He kept showing up to roles that didn't pay enough, to workshops that went nowhere, to auditions where he was seen as a model rather than a person. But he kept showing up. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. He also leaned on his other strengths. Martial arts, for example. He's a black belt. His body was trained not just for performance, but for strength and control. In an industry obsessed with aesthetics, he worked to be versatile, not just a dancer, not just a singer, not just an actor, but everything. And though it seemed like he was stuck behind the scenes, something was slowly building. A quiet force, a presence that couldn't be denied any longer. Because here's the truth. When someone like Vincent makes it through the tough process, when they keep going despite the odds, they don't just land a role. They become a symbol of possibility, of change, of what happens when talent refuses to conform. And one day, the door he'd been pushing for all these years finally opened. He didn't know it then, but everything was about to change. Success doesn't always come easy. Sometimes it creeps quietly into the room, disguised as one more audition, one more callback, one more chance to hear no. That's how it all started for Vincent Rodriguez III. Just one more chance. One more room, one more try. But this time, something was different. In 2015, the CW was casting a new show. Weird, musical, offbeat. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend wasn't your average romantic comedy. It was weird, edgy, self-aware. And at its core, the producers were looking for a leading man who could sing, dance, act, and make hearts flutter, and still be funny. A unicorn. And they found him in Vincent. Vincent auditioned for the role of Josh Chan, the handsome, sweet, slightly goofy ex-boyfriend who becomes Rebecca's obsession. He wasn't what the casting team had originally envisioned. He was Filipino-American, gay, shorter than most of the other leading men. But when he walked into the room and started singing, something happened. He didn't just fit the role, he defined it. For the first time in his career, Vincent wasn't asked to be a supporting character. He was the story. He was the love interest. He was the face on the poster. And more importantly, he didn't have to change who he was to get it. Landing the role of Josh Chan changed everything. The play was bold and different. It tackled mental health, heartbreak, love addiction, and identity through music and absurdist comedy. Vincent was front and center, dancing in elaborately choreographed routines, singing soulful solos, and expressing himself alongside a stellar cast. And for 4 seasons, 60 episodes, he brought Josh to life with warmth, charm, and depth. Audiences loved him, critics praised him, but behind the scenes, something even more powerful was happening. Vincent, an openly gay man, played a straight romantic lead on television, a rarity in 2015, and still a bold move today. In interviews, fans often expressed surprise. Wait, he's gay in real life? Not because they can't believe a gay man could play a straight man, but because Hollywood rarely allows it. Vincent didn't hide his identity to get a role. He didn't shrink to fit the leading man mold. He expanded the mold to fit himself. And in doing so, he shattered decades of assumptions about who a hero should be. But fame didn't change him. In fact, when the world first discovered Vincent, he had built a quiet, down-to-earth life. Just months before Crazy Ex-Girlfriend premiered, he married the love of his life, Gregory Wright. They met through mutual friends, shared a love of fitness and music, and built a strong, honest relationship outside the spotlight. Even though the movie introduced him to millions, Vincent remained unflappable. He spoke openly about being gay, about his husband, on what it means to be true to yourself in an industry that often demands silence. He didn't make his personal life a brand, but he didn't hide it either. And by making that choice, he gave visibility to a generation of queer Asian Americans who had never seen themselves reflected in the spotlight. As the show gained traction, Vincent began to receive feedback from fans around the world, many of them young, gay, and Asian, who saw something in him they'd never seen on TV before. Potential. The messages kept pouring in. Emails, letters, direct messages, people saying, "Because of you, I believe I can do this too." People who cried when they saw a face like theirs not only existing in the industry, but leading it. That impact can't be measured in ratings. But it comes with weight. Vincent often talks about the pressure he feels, not to be perfect, but to represent with integrity. He knows his success isn't just personal, it's symbolic. He's become one of the few openly gay Asian actors in Hollywood to play leading roles, and he carries that image with quiet strength. He also used his platform to advocate for better representation, for mental health awareness, for inclusive casting. He wasn't the loudest, but his presence spoke volumes. Every time he walked onto a set, danced on screen, or did an interview as himself, he was telling the world, "We exist, we matter, we belong here." Even after the series ended in 2019, Vincent didn't fade away. He continued to work on shows like With Love, Kenan, and even voiced animated films. But more importantly, he kept showing up as himself. No mask, no editing, just Vincent. And that was probably his best performance. Now imagine, an openly gay, Asian American man cast as the straight romantic lead on a major TV show. Not as the sidekick, not as the laugh track, but as the dream guy. The guy girls across America swoon over. What does that say about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go? What does it feel like to see someone like Vincent rewrite the rules, not by changing who he is, but by being true to himself? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Love didn't come quickly to Vincent Rodriguez III. It came quietly, gently, like a melody he'd known his whole life but never sung aloud until he met Gregory Wright. Gregory didn't come from showbiz. He didn't chase the spotlight. An American comic book editor, writer, and colorist, Gregory brought something different to Vincent's life: stability, sincerity, a kind of everyday magic hidden beneath the chaos of showbiz. They met through mutual friends, connected over shared values, and in August 2015, they married, just months before Vincent's breakout role as Josh Chan catapulted him into the national spotlight. While the world was discovering Vincent as a love interest in a quirky TV romantic comedy, he was quietly building something even more powerful at home: a life rooted in truth. In August 2016, Vincent posted a photo of their one-year wedding anniversary at Disneyland. The caption was simple, playful, and surprisingly sincere. In that moment, he wasn't just sharing a milestone, he was quietly making a statement that love, genuine, gay, everyday love, deserves to be shown. Hollywood hasn't always been kind to actors like Vincent. Coming out is often seen as a risk, especially for men auditioning for romantic leads. But Vincent didn't play by those rules. He didn't hide his marriage, and he didn't hide his identity just to fit someone else's leading man image. Instead, he stood up for his truth. "I don't pretend to be someone else to get a role. That's what makes me stand out," he once said. It wasn't arrogance. It was freedom. A hard-won freedom. A freedom that allowed him to go to work every day not as a different version of himself, but as his whole self. Marriage gave him that strength. In Gregory, he found not just a partner, but a mirror. A man who saw all of him and loved him in every way. That love didn't just give Vincent emotional clarity. It gave him armor. Because when the world questions your worth, coming home to someone who hasn't been through it is empowering. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It shows up in the quiet moments, in the rehearsals together, in the trips away, in the way Vincent talks about Gregory, not as an accessory to his fame, but as an anchor. The reason he can walk into a casting room or onto a red carpet, knowing exactly who he is. For so many in the business, authenticity feels like a luxury. For Vincent, it has become his trademark. Unforced, unchosen, just real. His marriage to Gregory didn't limit his career, it elevated it. It showed casting directors, producers, and audiences that love doesn't have to come at the expense of talent, that a gay man can play the woman of desire and still come home to the man he loves. And perhaps more importantly, it showed LGBTQ+ youth of color that they can dream bigger, that they don't have to trade fame for opportunity. Love and success can exist in the same frame. Because Vincent didn't just live his authentic self. He loved openly. When news of his marriage began to spread, something remarkable happened. There was no scandal, no backlash, no casting mishap. Instead, there was admiration, respect. Fans didn't turn away, they leaned in. And in a quiet, culture-changing moment, Hollywood saw something different. That queerness and desire weren't polar opposites. That a gay Asian man could be both someone's fantasy and their reality. Vincent and Gregory became quiet pioneers, not through tabloids or headlines, but through everyday presence. On red carpets, Vincent held Gregory's hand. In interviews, he mentioned Gregory's name without hesitation. No big campaign, no branding strategy, just two men choosing to be seen together in a world that often ignores them. And in its own way, it was revolutionary. It's easy to forget that rare openness in 2015. Especially for Asian American men in entertainment. Vincent's choice to come out wasn't just personal. It was political. It was generational. He didn't just love himself. He loved all the gay kids who were told to shrink, to be quiet, to be straight. This relationship gave him a self-confidence that no award, no casting call, no agent could ever give. Because success in Hollywood can be fleeting. But to be loved deeply and loved without regret, that's forever. It's what allowed him to bring tenderness to his characters, to act with vulnerability, to sing with heart. He became a man admired by women on screen, because he understood what it meant to admire and be admired completely and fearlessly in real life. Gregory wasn't pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was simply there. A presence, a companion. And that presence permeates Vincent's work. Not in obvious ways, but in the quiet strength that comes from knowing, I don't have to hide. And maybe that's the real love story. It's not just two men finding each other, it's one man finding the courage to love himself completely and letting the world see it. And maybe that's the real love story. It's not just two men finding each other, it's one man finding the courage to love himself completely and letting the world see it. And maybe that's why so many viewers were moved to tears. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. Two men. No drama, no script, just a quiet love, a love that lasts. A love that reminds us that we don't have to change ourselves to deserve joy. A story that dares to say, you don't have to choose between love and success, you deserve both. If this story touches your heart even a little, if it reminds you of your own journey, or gives you hope for the road ahead, please consider liking this video, sharing it with those who need it, and subscribing to our channel. Your support will empower us to continue uncovering stories like Vincent and Gregory's. Stories that aren't just beautiful, they're real, and they deserve to be known. When Crazy Ex-Girlfriend ended, many thought Vincent Rodriguez III had reached the pinnacle of his career. But for Vincent, that performance was never the end. It was just a spark that lit a fire that burned far beyond romantic comedies and the small screen. In the years that followed, Vincent didn't slow down, he expanded his career, spanning genres, mediums, and even continents. He appeared in the political thriller Designated Survivor, showing us that he could navigate the worlds of espionage and power with as much aplomb as he could sing Broadway ballads. In Insatiable, he danced to dark satire, while Keenan cast him in family sitcoms. And then there were With Love, Home Economics, and Christmas on Cherry Lane, each an opportunity for him to portray new shades of humanity, never compromising his own. But it wasn't just his face that stole the show. His voice, warm, soulful, recognizable, found a new home in animation and video games. He lent his vocal talents to characters in White Snake and Nezha, two modern takes on Chinese legends that subtly connected him to his Asian heritage. He voiced charming roles in Arlo the Alligator Boy, and then surprised fans with Mortal Kombat 1, bringing the digital world of warriors and magic to life. Whether talking, singing, or fighting in pixels, Vincent makes his presence felt. But the most powerful role he has ever played, one that didn't have a script, trailer, or premiere date, is that of an advocate. As an openly gay Filipino-American actor, Vincent belongs to a rare breed in Hollywood. And rather than hiding behind safe roles or carefully crafted silences, he has used his platform to speak out loudly, clearly, and lovingly for the communities that have shaped him. He has become a beacon for the queer Asian American community, a group that is often erased or stereotyped in mainstream media. His Instagram is filled with behind-the-scenes photos, but also encouragement for LGBTQ+ youth, reflections on racism in the industry, and tributes to those who came before him and paved the way for him. He didn't wait for Pride Month to get involved in politics. He used his voice year-round, showing up at protests, supporting trans rights organizations, raising funds for homeless LGBTQ+ youth, and speaking at events focused on inclusion, representation, and real change. For Vincent, it wasn't enough to just be visible. He wanted to be useful. He brought his passion into the classrooms and studios where he mentored young queer artists of color. He didn't just teach them how to act or dance. He taught them how to exist in spaces that weren't meant for them. He became the teacher he always wanted to be. And in doing so, he gave others the courage to step into the light. It's remarkable how seamlessly he juggled all of these roles, performer, advocate, husband, mentor, without letting one overshadow the other. "I don't just dance," he once joked in an interview. "I bake. Who wants to marry me?" But behind the jokes was a man who truly did it all. And with every turn, every monologue, every note he belted out, he proved that you don't have to choose between being yourself and being successful. You can be both. That message, perhaps more than any character he's ever played, is what fans love most about Vincent. It's why his story resonates so well, because it's not just about ambition, it's about authenticity. And that's why, when audiences see him on screen, whether dancing on stage, hosting a holiday movie, or voicing a heroic warrior, they don't just see an actor. They see potential. They see someone who doesn't wait to be seated at the table. He builds the seat for himself, then pulls it out for others. Vincent Rodriguez III is no longer just the romantic lead in a hit movie. He has become something more, a symbol of what happens when you refuse to shrink into comfort. A reminder that presence is power, but showing up with your heart is revolutionary. So the next time you see his name in the credits, whether on screen or behind a microphone, know that you're not just watching a performance. You're witnessing a legacy in motion. Vincent Rodriguez III didn't just chase the spotlight, he redefined it. As a gay Filipino-American, he broke barriers not by changing who he was, but by being true to himself. His journey wasn't about fame, but about living authentically in a world that didn't include him. In doing so, he proved that being yourself is the most powerful role and left a path for others to follow. In the entertainment industry, there are moments that feel like a gentle shift, gentle but enduring. And then there are moments that explode. Vincent Rodriguez III wasn't just trying to fill a role. He wanted to redefine the space, expand it, make it big enough for people like him to fit in. And somehow, with talent, heart, and a quiet rebellion in his bones, he did just that. In a landscape where straight white leads still dominate the romantic comedy genre, Vincent did the unthinkable. He played the guy, not the sidekick, not the comedic role, the leading man. And he did it without dimming his light, without clarifying his truth, and without softening his identity. A proud, gay Filipino-American actor took the stage, and it wasn't just a casting choice. It was a cultural shift, a statement, a love letter to everyone who's ever been told they were too queer, too brown, too different to be considered desirable. Vincent's performance in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend wasn't just entertaining, it was groundbreaking. He broke the mold of masculinity on American television. He challenged expectations placed on gay Asian men. He didn't just show up, he took over the space with grace, poise, and unfeigned joy. And the world took notice. He was honored on red carpets and award stages, from California to New York, but the real triumph was in the eyes of the audience, who saw themselves in him, perhaps for the first time. But behind the glamour was a deeper truth, a pain that many young gay Asians are all too familiar with. Vincent once said, "I was that kid who thought I shouldn't exist. Now I stand on stage and tell all the kids who look like me, you're not wrong." That's not just a quote, it's a lifeline. It's the kind of line that touches someone's heart and stays there forever. Because it's not just about Vincent. It's about every gay kid in Texas, Illinois, Hawaii, and Florida who's been forced to feel like their gender identity is too big, too small, or too complicated, or in need of adjustment. Representation isn't a trend, it's a lifeline. It tells a teenager in Georgia that their vulnerability isn't weakness. It tells a non-binary artist in Oregon that their truth has a place on stage. It tells a young gay man in Pennsylvania that his dreams aren't ridiculous, they're legitimate. And as Vincent dances, as he speaks, as he smiles through the screen, he tells them all, "You are seen, you are worthy, you are good enough." He represents a new kind of Hollywood, a Hollywood that no longer asks for permission to exist, a Hollywood that dares to take up space, a Hollywood that refuses to trade authenticity for applause. Vincent is part of a movement of queer Asian artists who are bold, multidimensional, and unafraid to combine tenderness with power. He is joined by voices like Bowen Yang from Nevada, Joel Kim Booster from Illinois, and many more who are rewriting the rules in real time. But Vincent's influence extends beyond the screen. He mentors, he lifts, he listens, he reaches out to young LGBTQ+ artists across the United States because he understands the weight of isolation. He knows what it's like to look around a room and see no one who looks like you, loves like you, or dares like you. And so he builds bridges. Not just in California or New York, but from Arizona to Washington to Massachusetts, connecting with Asian LGBT communities searching for light, truth, and possibility. He's not just telling a story, he's rewriting an entire chapter of American culture. Vincent reminds us that visibility isn't vanity, it's survival, and joy, and dignity. It's telling that kid in Ohio watching the credits roll with tears in her eyes, your story matters too. It's reminding a transgender singer in Michigan that they don't have to choose between their culture and themselves. It's showing the world that our beauty, our strangeness, our heritage can exist not in spite of each other, but because of each other. Vincent Rodriguez III can walk the stage as a man, but he carries the voice of thousands. And those voices from Arkansas to Colorado to North Carolina are getting louder, brighter, unabashedly better. This isn't just progress. This is pride with purpose. This is the new face of Hollywood. His presence in Hollywood sends a message to the world that our stories matter, that our love is not a side plot, that our identities are not too complicated to understand. He reminds us that the truth isn't always loud, but when it is loud, it can be glorious. It can heal. It can save a life. Hollywood has long rewarded those who conform, those who fit the mold, those who keep quiet. But voices like Vincent's are teaching Hollywood something new, that resistance is beautiful, that courage is contagious, and that the most powerful revolutions begin when someone refuses to pretend. If you take anything away from Vincent's journey, remember this: authenticity is not an act of defiance, it's an act of grace. Because every time you choose to be fully yourself, you give someone else permission to do the same. You may never know their name, you may never see their face, but someone, somewhere is drawing strength from your light. So if you are gay, if you are Asian, if you have ever been told you are not good enough, remember Vincent. Remember that you do not have to shrink to fit someone else's image of who you should be. You are never too much. You are never not enough. You are the story. You are the revolution. Vincent Rodriguez III is not just the face of a new Hollywood. He is the soul of a rising generation. A generation that believes in freedom through truth. A generation that finds strength in tenderness. A generation that understands that being gay and Asian is not a contradiction. It is a superpower. And if that's not worth celebrating, then what is? If you've ever been silenced by fear, let Vincent remind you, your voice is what the world is waiting for. From a boy who once felt invisible to a leading man who changed the face of love on screen, Vincent's journey proves that being true to yourself isn't just brave, it's revolutionary. To anyone still searching for themselves, keep going. You belong here. You are not alone. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. If Vincent's story touches you, please share it with someone who needs it. And let us know, have you seen a character like him on screen? Leave their name below. Because who knows, yours might just be the next story the world needs to hear.